Trade tensions and tariffs. The once relatively stable economic partnership between the United States and Mexico has taken a sharp turn toward conflict, largely driven by new trade policies introduced by U.S. President Donald Trump. These policies were designed with a clear goal: to encourage American companies to shift manufacturing operations back to U.S. soil and address the persistent trade deficit that has long been a point of contention in Washington. Trump's administration argued that imposing tariffs on goods coming from Mexico would incentivize domestic production, creating jobs and bolstering the U.S. economy. However, this move quickly sparked friction with Mexico, a country deeply intertwined with the U.S. through trade. Mexico sends about 80% of its exports north across the border, making its economy highly dependent on uninterrupted access to the U.S. market. In the year prior to these developments, the total trade volume between the two nations had surpassed an impressive $800 billion, a figure that underscores the sheer scale of their economic relationship. Any disruption to this massive flow of goods, whether through tariffs, policy shifts, or retaliatory measures, threatens to send shockwaves through industries and communities on both sides of the border. For the U.S., the tariffs were framed as a strategic play to regain economic control, but for Mexico, they represented an immediate challenge to its financial stability and a test of its ability to navigate pressure from its powerful northern neighbor. The tension that emerged wasn't just about numbers. It marked a shift in the dynamic between the two countries, turning a cooperative trade relationship into something more akin to a high-stakes standoff. Businesses reliant on cross-border supply chains, from automakers to agricultural producers, found themselves caught in the crossfire, facing uncertainty about costs, logistics, and future planning. Meanwhile, the Trump administration pressed forward, viewing the tariffs as a necessary tool to assert U.S. interests, even as Mexico began to weigh its own options for response. This clash set the stage for a broader confrontation, one that would reveal the fragility of their economic interdependence and the limits of unilateral policy in a deeply connected region. Mexico's response. In the face of mounting pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump's new trade policies, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum adopted a measured yet resolute stance, steering clear of aggressive retaliation that could escalate tensions further. Instead, she opted to showcase Mexico's strength through a blend of diplomacy and strategic control. One of her most significant early moves was deploying 10,000 National Guard troops to the northern border, a decision that served dual purposes. Strategic control. On one hand, it addressed U.S. concerns over the influx of drugs, particularly fentanyl, crossing into American territory, signaling Mexico's willingness to tackle shared challenges. On the other, it was a bold statement of intent, proving that Mexico was serious about managing issues that impacted both nations on its own terms. Far from simply bowing to American demands, Sheinbaum maintained a firm position, refusing to yield to pressures that threatened Mexico's sovereignty. Rather than rushing to mirror Trump's tariffs with countermeasures of her own, she chose a calculated approach, calm but unwavering, emphasizing that while Mexico valued its relationship with the U.S., it would not tolerate dictates that undermined its national interests. In public statements, she repeatedly underscored Mexico's independence, making it clear that cooperation with the U.S. was desirable, but only if it was rooted in mutual respect, not coercion. This stance was both pragmatic and symbolic, balancing the need to preserve bilateral ties with the imperative to protect Mexico's dignity against a far more powerful neighbor. Her approach resonated deeply at home, where many Mexicans saw her as a leader willing to stand up to what they perceived as years of U.S. overreach. The troop deployment wasn't just a practical step to secure the border. It doubled as a powerful emblem of Mexico's ability to govern itself without being dictated to from Washington. Sheinbaum's strategy turned Trump's challenge into an opportunity to assert her leadership, rallying national unity at a time of growing strain. By projecting strength without provocation, she positioned Mexico as a partner, not a subordinate, in the evolving dynamic with the United States, earning widespread domestic support for her principled resistance. Temporary relief. Amid rising tensions sparked by U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats, a brief respite emerged in March 2025 when he agreed to postpone their implementation for 1 month. This decision came as a welcome pause in what had become an increasingly fraught standoff between the United States and Mexico, offering a momentary sigh of relief to those most vulnerable to the economic fallout. For Mexico, where roughly 80% of exports flow to the U.S., the looming tariffs had cast a shadow over businesses and workers reliant on this trade lifeline. The delay was especially critical for exporters and industry leaders who had braced for immediate disruptions to a trade relationship valued at over $800 billion annually. In Mexico City, the news triggered a rare and vivid display of national unity as thousands gathered in the main plaza to celebrate the reprieve. The crowd's enthusiasm reflected not just relief from economic pressure, but also strong support for President Claudia Sheinbaum's leadership during the crisis. Her steady, diplomatic response to Trump's aggressive posture had struck a chord with the public, and this temporary victory bolstered her standing, with approval ratings soaring as high as 85% during the tariff saga's peak. For many Mexicans, the postponement was more than a practical win. It symbolized a moment of defiance against perceived U.S. bullying, a chance to rally behind a leader who refused to let Mexico be pushed around. Business owners, particularly in export-heavy sectors like automotive and agriculture, saw the delay as a lifeline, giving them a short window to regroup and strategize amid uncertainty. However, the pause didn't resolve the underlying issues driving the conflict. The core disputes over trade imbalances, migration, and border security remained simmering beneath the surface, with U.S. officials still pressing Mexico for tougher action on drug trafficking and undocumented crossings. Trump's concession was tactical, not a retreat, and it left both nations in a holding pattern, aware that the clock was ticking toward the next round of negotiations or escalations. For Mexico, the celebration was tempered by this reality. The tariff threat was delayed, not defeated, and Sheinbaum's ability to navigate the ongoing challenge would continue to be tested. The plaza's cheers marked a fleeting triumph, but the broader battle for economic stability and sovereignty was far from over. Economic impact. The trade dispute ignited by U.S. tariffs under President Donald Trump sent ripples of disruption through Mexico's economy, with effects reverberating across North America's tightly knit supply chains. Mexico, heavily reliant on the U.S. as a market for 80% of its exports, faced immediate strain as Trump's policies threatened a trade relationship worth over $800 billion annually. The automotive industry, a cornerstone of Mexico's economic strength, bore the brunt of this uncertainty. In January 2025, auto exports plummeted by 17.7%, hitting their lowest levels in over 2 years, a stark indicator of the tariff's toll. This wasn't just a Mexican problem. The decline rattled a cross-border production system where components like engines and wiring crisscross the border multiple times before cars reach U.S. showrooms. American automakers in cities like Detroit and Los Angeles faced potential delays and rising costs, which could soon translate into pricier vehicles for consumers. Beyond cars, the impact spread to other sectors. Agriculture, a vital link between the two nations, felt the strain as uncertainty loomed over exports of fresh produce. Think tomatoes, avocados, and strawberries that stock U.S. grocery shelves year-round, especially in winter. Any hiccup in this flow, from tighter border checks to retaliatory measures, risked spoilage and price spikes. Energy markets weren't immune either. U.S. refineries, particularly along the Gulf Coast, depend on Mexico's heavy crude oil, and disruptions there could drive up fuel costs. Supply chains stretching across the continent began to fray as companies paused operations or sought costly alternatives, unsure of what trade rules might look like in the coming months. The retail and logistics sectors, trucking firms, port operators, and warehouses also teetered, tied to the seamless movement of goods that was now in jeopardy. For everyday Americans, this meant higher prices at the pump and the checkout counter, while Mexican workers and businesses grappled with lost revenue and jobs. The economic fallout underscored a harsh reality. The interdependence that had fueled efficiency between the U.S. and Mexico was now a vulnerability. Trump's tariffs aimed to bolster U.S. manufacturing, but they risked destabilizing a regional economy where both sides relied on each other more than ever, turning a policy gambit into a costly game of brinkmanship with no clear winner in sight. Migration and border security. As trade tensions flared, migration emerged as a volatile flashpoint between the U.S. and Mexico, amplifying the strain on their relationship. For years, the U.S. has leaned on Mexico to act as a buffer, slowing the tide of migrants from Central America and beyond who trek north seeking entry into the United States. This unspoken arrangement saw Mexico intercepting, registering, or deterring many of these travelers before they reached the U.S. border, a role it played under various agreements despite occasional friction. But under President Claudia Sheinbaum, that dynamic shifted. She firmly rejected the idea of Mexico serving as Washington's gatekeeper, pushing back against Trump's demands for stricter controls on migration and drug trafficking. Sheinbaum argued that U.S. accusations of Mexico ignoring smuggling networks were baseless and insulting, insisting her country had already shouldered more than its share of the regional migration burden. She reframed the issue, casting it as a humanitarian and economic challenge rooted in deeper causes like poverty and violence in migrants' home countries, rather than a simple security fix. In a bold move, her administration suspended several economic cooperation deals tied to border management, a signal that Mexico wouldn't bend to U.S. pressure without pushback. These agreements had smoothed trade and infrastructure projects, and their pause rattled businesses in U.S. border states like Texas and Arizona, where cross-border stability is a lifeline. Sheinbaum's stance was clear. Mexico would collaborate with the U.S. and the U.S., but not at the expense of its sovereignty or dignity. This shift carried risks. If Mexico eased its role in detaining migrants, a surge could overwhelm U.S. border facilities, sparking a political firestorm in Washington. Trump doubled down, framing the border as a national security crisis and threatening sanctions or more tariffs to force compliance. His rhetoric fueled calls from his base to fortify the wall, while Sheinbaum's defiance struck a chord with Mexicans tired of being cast as an extension of U.S. immigration policy. Her government's pivot challenged decades of quiet cooperation, turning migration into a test of wills. Both leaders faced domestic pressures, Trump to deliver on hardline promises, Sheinbaum to protect Mexico's autonomy, making compromise elusive and the stakes higher than ever in this evolving standoff. Political dynamics. The escalating U.S.-Mexico standoff over trade and migration wasn't just an economic clash, it was a political tug-of-war shaped by contrasting domestic pressures. In Mexico, President Claudia Sheinbaum's firm resistance to Trump's tariffs and border demands won her widespread admiration. Many Mexicans, long frustrated by what they saw as U.S. dominance, rallied behind her as a leader who finally stood tall against external meddling. Her approval ratings soared, hitting 85% at the height of the tariff crisis, fueled by a sense of national pride in her refusal to let Mexico be dictated to from Washington. Public gatherings like the one in Mexico City celebrating the tariff delay underscored this unity, casting her as a symbol of defiance against a neighbor often perceived as overbearing. Meanwhile, in the U.S., Trump leaned into his hardline stance, amplifying rhetoric that painted the southern border as a chaotic threat to national security. His calls for Mexico to crack down harder on migrants and drugs played well with his base, particularly in southern states like Texas and Arizona, where speeches about a tougher border stance drew cheers. He framed any pushback from Mexico as evidence of its failure to cooperate, doubling down on tariffs as a tool to enforce compliance. Yet this approach wasn't without cracks. Business owners in those same border states, whose livelihoods depend on smooth trade with Mexico, grew vocal about the risks. Annie's aid of this approach went forward. They warned that prolonged tariffs or a breakdown in relations could devastate local economies, from trucking to retail, highlighting a rift between Trump's nationalist rhetoric and the pragmatic needs of commerce. This tension mirrored Mexico's own divide. While Sheinbaum's supporters cheered her resolve, some in the business community fretted over the uncertainty's toll on exports and investment. On both sides, leaders were pulled in opposing directions. Sheinbaum balancing sovereignty with economic stability, Trump juggling his base's demands with industry concerns. The political theater amplified the stakes, turning a trade spat into a broader contest of wills. Neither could afford to fully alienate the other, yet both played to their audiences, risking long-term damage to a relationship built on interdependence. What emerged was a fragile dance of defiance and dependence, with each leader's political fortunes hinging on how they navigated the other's moves. Mexico's leverage. While Mexico may not wield the military might or financial clout of a global superpower, its economic interdependence with the U.S. grants it a potent form of leverage in this escalating standoff. The two nations are bound by a web of trade that touches nearly every corner of daily life, from cars to groceries to energy. Take the automotive sector. American carmakers rely on Mexican factories for parts like engines and transmissions, a system so integrated that a single vehicle might cross the border multiple times during production. If Mexico slowed exports or slapped tariffs on these components, U.S. plants in places like Detroit could grind to a halt, driving up costs and car prices. Agriculture offers another pressure point. Mexico supplies a huge share of U.S. fresh produce like avocados and tomatoes, especially in winter when domestic options dwindle. A delay at the border, whether from stricter inspections or reduced shipments, could empty shelves and spike food prices fast. Then there's energy. U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are tailored to process Mexico's heavy crude oil, a resource not easily swapped out. If Mexico cut exports or hiked prices, moves it's historically considered to protect its own markets, fuel costs could climb, hitting American drivers and industries hard. Labor ties deepen this leverage. Mexican seasonal workers harvest crops across states like California and Texas, and any restriction on their movement could leave fields unpicked and farmers reeling. Geography amplifies this power. Unlike trade with distant nations, goods just need to roll across a shared border, but that proximity also means Mexico can snarl the flow with ease. Picture trucks backed up for days at checkpoints, factories stall, deliveries lag, and costs soar for U.S. consumers. President Sheinbaum seems keenly aware of this arsenal. By holding back from rash retaliation, she's kept these cards close, signaling that Mexico could flex them if pushed too far. The U.S. depends on this partnership more than Trump's rhetoric admits, and Mexico's ability to disrupt supply chains, from auto parts to oil, gives it a quiet but real edge. This isn't about confrontation, it's about control. Mexico's leverage lies in its capacity to make the U.S. feel the cost of overreach, turning economic reliance into a strategic tool in a high-stakes game where both sides need each other more than they might care to concede. Broader implications. What began as a trade dispute between the U.S. and Mexico has morphed into something far weightier, a symbolic showdown over power, autonomy, and the future of their relationship. This isn't just about tariffs or border policies. It's a clash of visions. President Claudia Sheinbaum has cast Mexico's stance as a push for a modern partnership, one grounded in fairness and mutual respect, rather than the old dynamic where the U.S. called the shots. In her speeches, she stressed that Mexico seeks to collaborate with its northern neighbor, not serve as its subordinate, urging a reset that reflects today's realities over outdated hierarchies. Her refusal to bow to Trump's pressure, whether on trade concessions or migration controls, frames this as a fight for dignity, a chance to redefine how two deeply linked nations coexist. On the flip side, Trump has dug in, portraying Mexico's resistance as defiance that justifies his hardline tactics. He's pitched tariffs and border crackdowns as essential to force Mexico into line on drugs and migrants, a message that fires up his supporters but glosses over the shared stakes. This isn't a simple policy spat. It's a test of who holds sway in a relationship tethered by geography, trade, and culture. The outcome could ripple beyond economics, shaping how these neighbors navigate everything from security to labor for years to come. Sheinbaum's strategic restraint, opting for diplomacy over tit-for-tat escalation, hints at a long game, betting that Mexico's economic leverage can outlast Trump's bluster. Meanwhile, Trump's approach risks alienating a partner whose cooperation the U.S. can't easily replace, especially as supply chains teeter. The stakes are high. A breakdown could fracture a regional economy that thrives on integration, while a resolution might forge a new balance of power. Migration adds another layer. Sheinbaum's shift away from being the USS border enforcer challenges decades of quiet compromise, forcing both sides to rethink how they handle a shared crisis. As tensions simmer, the world watches a drama that's less about winning a trade war and more about who can endure, who controls the lifelines, and who's willing to adapt. The choices made now will echo far beyond the border, setting the tone for a partnership too vital to unravel but too strained to stay the same.